bunch of things, but we're going to try to reschedule everything for 7 days from now, next Wednesday at noon. We will first of all confirm the library is open then. I will get in touch with the speaker and confirm that, that Gabriella is available to present, either in person, and if not in person, then by Zoom. So that is our current plan. Unfortunately, we do not have a speaker, ergo we do not have a presentation. I apologize deeply to all of you for this unfortunate eventuality, but I'm sure our talk will unfortunately be just as timely next week as it is this week. So I just wanted to announce that to all of you. I'm very sorry, my apologies, but we will have our 9th and final talk hopefully in 7 days' time at noon.
Well, you're going to be our fill-in speaker for the day.
I could, but I have nothing prepared, alas. I could try, but yes, so I just wanted to make you all aware of that. I'm terribly sorry for, you guys going to the trouble of getting here and everything, but...
I know you don't have anything prepared, I understand.
Oh, yeah, questions, yes.
You're a student of history and all that.
Yes.
I know there's hardly anything going on in the world today. Everything we're hearing about, the struggle with how it's just an unbelievable change in Europe and their attitude.
Yes.
And they're doing, is the change in the world as significant as we read in the media?
I think it can be. It was one of those things that wasn't going to happen until the event happened, which is, the argument is why did they do these sanctions beforehand? Well, you had to have the transgression, the unprovoked aggression for the Europeans to decide, okay, this is serious, we can't allow this to happen. I would say it's similar as a moment to when, but in different ways, somewhat similar, somewhat different, to when Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990. Which again, we had no defense treaty with Kuwait, we had no real defense relationship with them, but we came to their defense, we built up a coalition of European partners, of some Arab countries, Egypt and Syria, each sent a division to support us and so forth, and take part in the fighting. And that was actually the moment, that was of course right at the end of the Cold War. Berlin Wall falls November 1989, Soviet Union dissolves December 1991. And so it's in the middle of that. And they're in the process of, is the Cold War over? And the media is saying the Cold War is over. And George Herbert Walker Bush, the president, is telling everyone, don't say the Cold War is over. A, we don't want to poke Russia and cause them to become belligerent again, and B, we're not sure this is the case. And so that was the case until August 1990. Then in the month between the invasion on the beginning of August and then when he met with Gorbachev in September, that month period, Bush realized the Cold War was over. And that was because the fact that everyone was aligning against Iraq, even though the Soviets had built up their army and so forth and were allowing us to liberate Kuwait and so forth, and were not making any sort of a fuss for supporting us in the Security Council and so forth, was proof to Bush that the world had definitively changed. In the Cold War, the whole situation there would have played out a lot differently. And so then actually in September, when he meets in Finland with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, Bush actually says he wants to close the book on the Cold War. So in that case, that was a shift in an era, and now 30 years later, I think this is a shift in the era, in a different way, but similar sort of thing where people didn't know what they were going to do until it happened. So, yeah, I will, yes.
Do you think that Putin did miscalculate?
Yes, I think Putin was not expecting to have to invade, that his hope was he would get concessions, that the Europeans would fissure, Russia wants his gas, Britain wants his oligarchs' money and so forth, that they would buckle in some way, and Ukraine would buckle in some way, and he didn't expect it. Now, with 200,000 troops on the border, he can't exactly retreat without looking terrible, so he kind of had painted himself into a corner where he had to do something, which I don't think he wanted to do, and once he did it, he thought it would be easier than it was. So he, I don't think, was planning for this, and if it had to happen, he did not think, he just thought he could send a couple troops into Kiev, scare everyone, overthrow the government, that it would be easy anyway. So in his case, he is in very uncharted territory he had not prepared for. His previous invasions of Georgia, of Crimea, tended to involve a series of circumstances. There were limited amounts of troops, limited amounts of combat, a local population that wanted him there. And furthermore, he wasn't taking an enemy capital. He was pushing aside the enemy and establishing kind of like a border strip where he could have a local puppet ruler in place. So it's a very simple sort of thing. And in this case, it's a totally different scale. So it differs markedly from all his other aggressions in a variety of factors, which is why many people, okay. Which is why many people didn't think he would do it. Which is why many people didn't think he would do it. So that's important to understand as well. That this is a military action of the sort of a scope he has not done before.
I think it also is interesting to see where a comedian who was elected president.
Yes. And not just a comedian who who actually played a president. His main role was he played a television show where a comedian accidentally becomes president, and then he becomes actual president. It's important to understand that in its 30 years since independence, Ukraine has not been well served by its political class. It had kind of a corrupt Kremlin stooge for 15 years. Then it had an election. It had a Ukrainian nationalist president who wasn't very competent. It had a highly corrupt elected pro-Russian president who was overthrown. Its previous president before this, Mr. Poroshenko, was a billionaire candy mogul who didn't do anything to undo the incredible corruption in the state because he was a part of it. So the idea was we might as well try something new, something completely out of the box, and so forth. And so that's how he ended up in this position, that their political class had failed them and they wanted someone. And and also the other interesting point was before this, he's been in the office for 3 years. He hadn't done very well. He hadn't gotten rid of any of the corruption. He hadn't cracked down on the economic barons who sucked the state dry and so forth. So his supporters had been disappointed before 7 days ago, and now everything's completely changed. Yes?
I'm just curious as to, I'm pretty ignorant about world affairs. Crimea, did we have an option to not let him go in, to stop him from going in there? And had we done that, would this have...
Yes. Crimea was a unique situation in that Crimea had Russia's main Black Sea naval base in Sevastopol there. So when Ukraine became independent, they let Russia have troops and all their ships there. So the Russians, before they took Crimea, had 20,000 soldiers there, and the Ukrainians had fewer. So it was one of those things that was there for the taking to begin with. And plus its population had very few Ukrainians, a large number of Russians. So again, the population didn't mind the switch in sovereignty. In fact, many welcomed it. And so in that case, the idea of the world cracking down on our current situation is based on the Ukrainian people resisting. The Crimean people, with few exceptions, did not resist. They, in fact, welcomed it. So the conditions weren't there to stop it. And furthermore, since the Russians had, the ships and the men, there was no ability to counteract that. So that was a different sort of situation because the Russians had the old Soviet bases there and had soldiers there and so forth, and considered it like a honorary part of their territory already. So that made it different than the rest of Ukraine in that sort of way, if that makes sense. So Crimea was plus the Europeans were not outraged enough about it to do nearly as much as now. So you could not have gotten Germany to give up its gas or the British to give up the Russian investment and so forth, which props up much of London. So that was the main issue there. Yes. So it would have been, I suppose if the world had acted more drastically to Crimea, this would not have happened, but the world was not prepared to. So yeah, it's what's known in international affairs as salami slicing. You take, you can't take the whole salami, but you can take a little strip, and eventually you get the whole salami if you take enough strips. And that's kind of what Putin had done in Georgia. It's what he did in Crimea, and then now. And that was assumed what he'd do here, that he would extend the Russian foothold in eastern Ukraine and try to expand that and see if the Europeans would, if he just takes more land along his border, would the Europeans do anything? In this case, he abandoned that sort of approach. And so then they were willing to crack down. So it's one of those situations where it could have happened, but people were not willing to do it or to bear the costs at that time. Other questions? Yes, sir. And then you.
I was reading about that Finland and Norway
yes.
are not members of NATO.
Finland and Sweden. Norway is a member of NATO.
But I wondered if this will get a more push, will they, seeing what's happening here, will they?
They have been toying for it for a while, and they may toy with it more seriously. The issue there is traditionally their economies were very strongly tied with supplying stuff to Russia. So they would have to reorient that some way. That's the first issue, especially with Finland. The second issue with Sweden is they have their own independent military infrastructure. They make their own planes. Saab, the car company, is also an aircraft company that makes fighter jets. And if they joined NATO, they'd fear they'd lose that. They'd have to use American weapons and so forth. And so they have a whole mini, but still their military-industrial complex that they would want to keep. They, by the way, have conscription. So every Swede has to serve in the military for 2 years when they turn 18. So they have their own independent military identity that they may now, but if they feel insecure, they may want to at least have some sort of partnership with NATO. So that could very well happen in that way. And that's been talked about a while. It was talked about a bit during the war in Georgia in 2008, and then it came up this year when the Ukrainian situation started getting really dangerous. So that is always a possibility. The issue there is their economic ties to Russia. And before that, their economic ties to the Soviet Union, which is why they didn't join NATO in the first place, because they were, strongly in terms of selling consumer goods, which the Soviets couldn't make to them, and that benefiting their economy, given their proximity to Russia. That it just, that was a main issue. Because the Cold War, different than today, the regions were separate. The communists traded with each other. The capitalists traded with each other. There's very little trade in between. Very different Russia and Europe now. Very different China and everyone now. So that's a big difference when they say a second Cold War. It's not like the original Cold War, because those were sealed blocks, and the situation is very different now. Question?
Yes. Can you think of any scenario in which Putin can save face and withdraw?
At this point, very difficult. He could, something about, without overthrowing the government, I don't think he could do anything which Ukraine would accept at this time. That is the problem. That there would be things that could happen which he could claim victory, but Ukraine would not accept them at this point. So I don't think there is a meeting point between the two sides now. After all, they were going to meet this week in Belarus to discuss, or along the Belarusian-Ukrainian border to discuss this, and then Belarus's leader decided he was going to join in the invasion. So that kind of signals how this sort of thing is going in that regard. So I think he's got the point where he believes he just got to keep pressing and hope for victory. So he's very much in a corner. The important thing to understand there is Putin, as a young man, he always tells the story when he was a child. He grew up poor, and he was in his little apartment with his family, and it was rat infested. And he always talked about, like, the most dangerous thing in the world is a cornered rat, because they will do anything to survive. And so and he says this to people constantly. So his idea is, like, he sees Russia as a cornered rat. And, like, don't put me in the corner because I will rip your face off, or whatever. And he has now made himself into that cornered rat. So he has that sort of attitude where, if he gets in that position, it's uncertain what he would do to try to get out of it in that way, because of his nature and his view of the world. Yes?
Would you comment on people like Condoleezza Rice's comments that he's not the same person, that he has somehow lost it?
Well, and he has changed. The French have made this, Macron made this comment too, that when he met with him on that famous long table a couple months ago, it was completely different than when, than the Putin you saw in 2019. I think a lot of it is COVID accentuating the fact of dictators tend to be very isolated. Solo rulers tend to have small circles, which over time get smaller and smaller, and they're isolated from their people, they're isolated from their government. Putin made it worse during COVID by basically putting himself in a sort of palace bunker and seeing hardly anyone. And so he's lost whatever, little input he had from people who he trusted, who could give him advice. He's completely lost that. So in that way, he's not as much in touch with the information as he would have been before. So I think that has changed him somewhat. I mean, we all know, what it was like, during quarantine and stuff. Now imagine that as a ruler for 2 years, and so I think psychologically he's changed. I think also he has no one who can tell him no anymore, or he's willing to, and that becomes a big issue with all dictators at this point. When yes, when the regime becomes kind of what we call personalistic, and there's no, and the person can't, no one can stand up to the person, the military, the intelligence people, the advisors, and so forth. And then it's just whatever the person says happens, and that becomes the win. I mean, getting back to the point about did Putin expect to do this, there are reports of Russian soldiers not even knowing they were in Ukraine, who had been there and weren't expecting an invasion and thought they were taking part in military exercises, and then people shot at them. So that shows how surprising this was and how little they had prepared the army for what it was going to do. I'll go ahead and say other questions over here. Yes?
Yes, well, I just heard you say that no one can say no to him.
Yes.
You know, there have been some reports that all his military advisors, all of his advisors are not fully in line with his.
Yes.
But if no one can say no to him, what's your thinking on the possibility of a coup?
Generally, historically, the chances of that are often overblown because the people around him are tied to him financially and in other ways. So if he goes down, they go down. A good example is Saddam. So Saddam Hussein, again, invades Kuwait in 1990, and everyone assumes he loses, he gets kicked out of Kuwait, he's lost so much prestige, his inner circle will surely overthrow him. That obviously didn't happen, but that was one of the big reasons Bush didn't go to Baghdad, was because he figured, and he was told by everyone, by the leader of Saudi Arabia, by the leader of Egypt, by the leader of Turkey, Saddam can't survive this. He loses, he's gone. That's it. And they weren't expecting like a popular uprising like happened. They were expecting his inner circle, like you said, to just say, it's enough, we'll take over now, and we'd have a, to use Bush's phrase, a kinder, gentler dictatorship in Iraq that we could deal with. And that obviously didn't happen, despite sanctions and everything over the next dozen years, and led to the 2003 invasion. And I think with Putin, it's a similar sort of thing, that everyone who was with him originally, who has doubts about him, has kind of left, often the country with their money or what have you, and they are no longer in a position, and so the people around him are implicated with him and have no choice but to go along, because he goes, they go. Other important thing to keep in mind is that there was a Russian general, a retired colonel, who actually wrote about 3 weeks ago that this is a very bad idea, this shouldn't happen, this will be a folly. He then, a week before the invasion, appeared on Russian television saying how superhuman the Russian army was and how nothing could stop them. So Putin, that says Putin was worried that this military figure had crossed him, and B, that he had to bring this guy in line, and he did bring the guy in line in ways which basically he completely recanted and so forth. So that, again, about the military, that he's worried about it, but he has enough power to get people to stay in line. Yes.
I've heard so many different things about nuclear weapons. I've heard that
yes.
They have now are 60 times bigger than what we dropped in Hiroshima.
Yes, they're 1,000 times bigger. Yes.
Then I've heard that Putin was seeking more directorial nuclear weapons that would be more battlefield efficient, and not go outside that area. I mean, I don't know what to believe anymore. Well,
there's the intercontinental ballistic missiles, which go all the way around the world, which we have aimed at each other. He's also done short-range missiles with like a 400 to 1,000-mile range, which could hit Eastern or Central or Western Europe. Those he's deployed. In terms of battlefield nukes, that was more an American thing than a Soviet thing, and we've gotten rid of ours. One of the problems there is your soldiers have to go fight amidst the nuclear fallout and stuff. So it was, the US we developed nuclear missiles at the time. We developed nuclear missiles in the 1950s that could fire like 50 miles and be used basically as giant artillery pieces. And we also developed nuclear shells. We tried to develop a nuclear mortar called the Davy Crockett, which had, I think it was a 10-mile blast radius and a 5-mile range of, so it's basically a suicide weapon. So that, no soldier would fire it, so they realized this wasn't, but that was basically the fact that the Soviets had so many tanks and so many men, the US Army in West Germany basically believed that's the only way we can survive. But the Soviets did less with developing that.
Do you think he's crazy enough to do that?
To launch nuclear at us or at any other country, I seriously doubt it. I think he's trying to scare us. We've done a similar thing too. So in Vietnam, when Nixon took over and the war wasn't going well, he put the U.S. on high alert and tried to make the North Vietnamese think we were going to nuke Hanoi. What Nixon openly referred to as the madman theory, that if they think I'm crazy, they'll give in. And they did not think he was crazy, and of course they did not give in. So we've tried this too at times, you know, like, but I think that is more or less what he's trying to do. He's trying to make us think he'll do it, but again, that is a whole other step in that regard. More or less, China, Russia, their idea of nuclear weapons is we use them if we ourselves are invaded. So it's a way to defend your own sovereign territory. That also gets to the issue of, you know, if we have a war with China and Taiwan, at what point would they use nuclear weapons? So in that case, there would be even greater issues there, in part because the Chinese would be firing missiles at Taiwan from China, and then we'd have to bomb China itself. To take out those missiles and so forth. And so that would raise a whole other issue. In this situation, given what we have and what they have and stuff, I think he would threaten it, but I seriously doubt he would actually resort to that level. And so that's my take there. I will say regarding China, people have because China is in some ways the country that is closest, the power that is closest to Russia. And, so what's China think about this? I will say that, they met with Putin at the Olympics. They seem very buddy-buddy. They kind of somewhat endorsed Putin's tough stance there. They did not condemn the invasion before it happened. They did not condemn it after it happened, but they didn't support Putin either. And furthermore, yesterday, a Chinese official basically gave a statement deploring the violence and so forth, which he didn't name Putin by name, but he kind of said this is a bad thing. So the Chinese, I think, what the Chinese are doing is they're what is referred to as bandwagoning. They're going with the winner. So if it looked like Putin was going to win easily, they were not going to criticize him and stuff and see that as, it's another black eye for the West and America looks weak and so forth. But if it got bogged down, they'd start to hedge. So I think China basically, so like when they went to the UN Security Council to condemn this, and obviously Russia vetoed, and they wanted China to also veto. China did not veto, it abstained, which is what China always does. America is the great vetoer on the Security Council. China is the great abstainer. It doesn't veto, but it abstains from everything. It refuses to take a position. And they did that on this, and the Russians were disappointed in them. So I think China, its view is that it doesn't want trouble. This is bad for it because it has it's Ukraine's second biggest trading partner. It wants to build a railroad from China to Europe that goes through Ukraine. And so this causes, if this drags on, and it causes problems for China. It hurts China more than it helps them. So I'm not saying they would turn on Putin, but they're kind of waiting to see where things are going, depending which way the wind blows in terms of their take on it. So that's an important part also to understand. Yes, and then yes.
You think that bandwagon thing is Turkey also?
Turkey, it would be. But Turkey did invoke the Montreux Agreement to close the straits to warships and so forth. I think Turkey is more worried about. They like to have good relations with Putin because he's their neighbor and so forth. And Erdogan, the Turkish president, has become more and more of an autocrat over the last decade. So he sees he has certain things in common with Putin. On the other hand, I don't think they want this sort of blatant aggression. Own interest too. So for instance, there was a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over some disputed territory last year, and the Russians supported their ally Armenia, and Turkey gave all sorts of weapons, including very deadly drones, to Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan won that war very convincingly because of Turkish help. And so they're not, they will pursue their own interests, and their own interest is not to have Ukraine destroyed, and is to maintain the balance there. So I think they're acting, they're more balancing than bandwagoning. They see Russia right now as a threat rather than a benefit to them, and they're trying to keep Russia, away and stuff in that way. Because Hungary so Hungary is Germany originally before the war was not going to send weapons to Russia. They've completely gone back on that, and they are sending weapons now. Hungary has said that they will not allow a transshipment of weapons through their territory. So they're still remaining relatively, friendly to Putin because Putin has been friendly to them. But again, as things go badly, they may switch around as well, since they have no, that regime is firmly entrenched, so they are not. It's not like Belarus, where the leader Alexander Lukashenko is completely dependent on Putin, especially now for survival. So Hungary may back away slowly if things seem to be going bad for Russia as well. They don't want to antagonize Russia, but they're in no position to help Russia either. And yes, sir.
1945, the UN was formed.
Yes.
Strictly for this type of purpose.
Well,
the first step
yes.
came in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
They stepped in, got
right.
countries in there. Since then, the UN hasn't done anything about trying to do anything here.
Yes.
Other than saying you shouldn't be doing that.
Right. Well, the UN was designed by the winners of World War II, and they all protected their interests. So you have the vetoes and so forth, and it was designed to basically allow the winners to kind of keep the peace and so forth. And so it had those flaws to begin with in that regard. You are right about that. The UN was also designed as a way where nations could discuss things before they got out of hand. So basically to prevent a World War I, where you have representatives there who can discuss things and so forth. It has calmed some conflicts in the past, such as, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where U.S. at the UN were able to that could have gone in a completely different direction without that. So they do serve, but they're only as good as the countries that are a part of them, and the Russians are one of the big five there. So it is expressly not designed to handle that sort of thing. So that is a but it's a weakness by design in a way. Because if that didn't exist, like let's say if the U.S. didn't have a veto, then they could have gotten upset at us over Iraq or over Vietnam or things like that and tried to condemn the U.S. then. So it's designed with that purpose in mind, where the big guys protect themselves. So yes, I do think the UN is regrettably not powerful enough or relatively powerless to handle this. But then again, the idea of the UN was to prevent great powers from going to war with each other, and we're still avoiding that in terms of, as long as the Cold War happened, for 45 years, you had the US and the Soviets as enemies, but Russian soldiers and American soldiers never shot at each other. And so, that is still the case. And so that is, as Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said during the Georgia invasion, we have one rule in foreign policy, and that is don't get into shooting war with the Russians. We avoid that sort of thing. They support our enemies, we support their enemies, but we don't directly engage each other. So I guess, yes, it's how much expectation you have with the United Nations, and I've generally had relatively little, so it's not, it's better than nothing, but it's not something I feel especially, disappointed in that regard, in that way. It's not it's certainly not a world parliament. You have, as Professor Chris Lane said, a system of anarchy where, nations do what they will and do what they wish, and the UN can modify that around the edges, but can't really change it. Other questions? Yes.
Who do you think will win the war?
I don't see how Russia wins, but I don't see what Russia does if it loses, and especially internally. Given the nature of Ukraine resistance, even if they can take the cities they are currently attempting to besiege, their supply lines will be attacked. You'll have fighting going on in terms of guerrilla warfare and stuff. They'll be worn down. The Russians will tire of the casualties. One thing Putin has done is in his military adventures, has kept casualties very limited. And that will cause domestic dissent and so forth, and plus the sanctions and but what at this point is now almost an economic blockade more than sanctions has really bit the Russians, and I think that will cause additional problems too. So I think the longer this goes on, the more progress Russia will make militarily, but the more it will suffer in every other way. It's military through guerrilla warfare in Ukraine, its economy, things like that. It's public through, this is not what we signed up for. So I do think over time, even at times where it appears like Russia will be winning, they won't really be, and so forth. And so I don't see this turning out in any sort of way that they had hoped for. On the other hand, I don't know what that means. I don't know what the end game is here in terms of both within Russia and within Ukraine and so forth in that regard. Yes?
Do you think he's going to continue to poll in the 80s with his people?
It depends. I mean, some of those polls, obviously, you don't want to say something bad about the dictator and things because he's the dictator. Sometimes he's been in the 60s. I think his support has been waning over the last couple of years because COVID hit Russia pretty hard, and their economy is 10% smaller now than it was in 2010. So that they haven't, So the whole point of Putin it was a deal where you gave up your freedom for some basic measure of prosperity or at least economic security, and that is no longer in operation. So he was still popular, but not as popular as he had been before. And this will cause that to further erode. But of course, dictators can be in power with relatively little popularity. Look at Saddam Hussein, especially if there's no outlet for the dissent. Yes.
I was quite surprised this morning when I heard, and it may not be true, but I don't know why I would have heard it if it wasn't, because it was on the news. That Ukraine and Russia are two of the largest wheat producers in the world.
Yes.
And how do you think that's going to be? Is that by the same?
I've heard about that, how it could affect bread prices and stuff around the world. That could have an effect, though, of course, we produce immense amount of wheat, too, as does Australia, Canada, Argentina, and so forth. So I think other countries can step it up. I mean, there are plenty of farmers in the U.S. who don't produce as much as they could because if they did, it would drive down the price. So I think the market has enough slack to handle that. Oil is a different matter, if only because oil markets are very tight and don't like instability. So we'll see, unfortunately, $4 gas and stuff pretty soon. So that will affect things. As opposed to natural gas, which the Europeans are dependent on for heat, it's important to remember that if Putin really wanted that to sting, he would have invaded in November, at the start of the winter. But now, it's going to be, they sell, I think, 3/4 of their natural gas in winter and far less in spring, summer, fall. So, there's a month, it'll be tough for Europe, but I mean, they have reserves and things that they've stockpiled. And then once, April hits and even late March, there'll be less of a worry about that in terms of natural gas. But in terms of wheat, it could cause disruptions, but I think the way agriculture is set up worldwide, that can be handled. Yes?
Speaking of timing, I mean, this is not exactly the worst time to fight a land war
right.
in Russia, but it's not great. In spring, they were talking about
yes.
tanks already bogging down.
Yes. I think Putin expected it to be very short. As he, at one point after Crimea, snapped at Angela Merkel, he said, "I can take Kiev in a week." So, the retort to that is, of course, yes, but can you hold it for a month? And so, but he, yes, it's very hard to have a good timing for a war in that region because not only is it freezing in winter and muddy right before and right after, it's also really, really hot in the summertime, like 100 degrees. It gets hotter there than it does in East Texas in the summertime because you're kind of in the middle of a continent. Kind of like if you've been to Minnesota or the Dakotas in summer, in July. And so it's always very tough for soldiers. In fact, when Napoleon invaded in 1812, more French soldiers died in the heat of July than they did in the winter of December. So, they were already dying from the heat as they were trying to march their way to Moscow, even before they froze on their way back. So the answer to that question is there's really never a good time, or there's narrow windows. So it's something you have to just deal with. Yes, you, and then yes.
Okay. I've been reading about how Ukraine is rich in natural resources like agriculture and minerals repeatedly. And then I ran across this one heavy article from a magazine called tabletmag.org, it said it remains one of the poorest countries on the continent.
Yes. The
So
conundrum
both true or what?
They're both true. Ukraine is just very mismanaged economically. It has iron and wheat. So in the middle of the country, you have large wheat fields, and in the east, the part which Russia borders, you have lots of iron, and that was a major industrial center for the Soviet Union. Of course, plenty of other countries have iron and steel now, so that by the end of the Soviet Union had basically become a rust belt. It was uncompetitive. It was, it was a area where it was economically in a time of downturn. So that part, that would have required immense investment to get them up to the technological level of modern day steelmakers in the US or Japan or China or Germany. So that's the problem there. Agriculturally, yes, they are very wealthy, but the country is very mismanaged. Like in the Russia, the state-owned enterprises were almost given away for very little to a small number of connected people who then became billionaires. So Russia has its oligarchs, or had it before Putin kind of broke them and first made them subservient to him and then replaced them with even more pliable oligarchs. But basically, Ukraine has its mini oligarchs. It has people who steal the economy and rob it. So Ukraine has immense corruption. It is poorly run. Its economy is poorly organized and so forth. So that explains the conundrum. Yes, that Ukraine has the potential to be quite prosperous, like say, like on the level of Poland or something. But it has not had. Poland has been doing relatively well. So yes, so Ukraine could do better, but it's been very mismanaged, and that has not changed with successive different rulers. So but that is a very good question, and that is very important to understand.
Do you believe that this would be the beginning of World War III?
Highly doubtful, in that, again, the World War III would, as Albert Einstein once said, we don't know what wars World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. That essentially you go so far back that it's not worth it for anyone, even more so than like normal wars in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, to put it mildly. So I don't see that happening, if only because there are certain steps you could take, like, in that case, Putin launching nuclear weapons or something, which would make it, which would not be in his interest. He'd have, there'd be nothing left. Russia would be vaporized. So he knows that. Furthermore, this has been managed before. So like in Korea in 1950, when the UN did, that was the United Nations Army. So the US stops the North Korean invasion. It briefly conquers North Korea. And we felt by November we were very, secure and ready to beat North Korea. In fact, in October, after Pyongyang was taken, the North Korean capital, Bob Hope, of all people, performed there. He performed there for the USO. So that's how secure we were in North Korea. But nonetheless, we had gone to the border, and we weren't expecting the Chinese to invade, or if they did, we could contain them. And then the Chinese invaded, and it was a debacle for the Americans, a very near complete disaster in that regard. And even then, when we're fighting the Chinese and the Soviets are flying planes and our pilots are dogfighting with them, our Sabres against their MiGs, we still managed it in such a way to avoid World War III. So the big worry when the Korean War happened was, would the Soviets use our distraction to invade West Germany? Would they take Berlin and invade? Because we're committed over here. Are they going to do something over there? And it was the same worry by Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Is this a feint to start World War III and take over Western Europe? In this situation, the Russians completely lack the capacity to do that. Something like 80% of their maneuverable troops are currently either in Ukraine or on the border. So they're in no position to start additional wars. And secondly, we've been in this position before in far worse situations, like in Korea, far more dangerous situations, and people have managed to always limit it and pull it back from the brink, because they recognize that and they manage it. So I do see, I do not see this leading to a global conflagration. And again, getting back to the Chinese, that is not in their interest, and that's kind of why they're starting to kind of back away slowly from Putin in that regard, because because that's not in their financial and other interests as well at the time. Yes.
Can you speak a little bit about the refugee refugee crisis?
Yes, yes.
See how it might affect Europe and
It will. It depends how long it lasts. The closest analogy I can give is Kosovo. When that war started, which the U.S. was involved with for 78 days early in 1999, you had something like an equivalent number of refugees, about 500,000 refugees flooding into Albania, Macedonia, the nations around Kosovo at the time. But they went back in a couple months. So it depends how long it lasts. The Europeans are certainly wealthy enough to handle it. I mean, after all, during the Syrian war, you had millions of refugees in the tiny country of Jordan. And they've handled that without problems. Afghanistan, during the war in the 1980s, 3 million Afghans fled to Pakistan, and then now similar things are happening again. So given other refugee outflows in places which are far less able to handle them, I think that can be relatively well dealt with. Plus, the places they're going, like Romania or Poland, see them as kind of their compatriots. So it's totally different than like the Syrian refugees. They don't see them as outsiders. They see them as, fellow Europeans, fellow Christians, things like that, and they're willing, at least for a time, to take care of them in that way. So I see it more like Kosovo, which was a problem for the neighboring countries who often didn't want them, but was dealt with okay. Yes, sir, you had a question?
I forgot what it was.
No problem. Other questions? Others? Yeah. Yes.
Hey, I read the chapter, and I mean, the focus is U.S. foreign policy.
Yes.
It pretty much stops with Obama.
Okay, I have not read the chapter. I have the chapter, but I have not read it, so I don't know what the weaknesses with it are. That is a very big weakness in that regard. But then again, that chapter right now is completely out of date. So it doesn't. Even if it didn't get up to the, it would have. Even if it had gone all the way through Trump and the first year of Biden, it would be completely, worthless by now anyway. Yes. You had a question?
Are you looking at me?
Yes.
I have.
Yes. Shoot.
All of your rationales were very rational.
Oh, yes.
Nothing will probably happen. But in the media, the word megalomaniac is finally being used.
Yes.
And when you're dealing with a megalomaniac, don't think rationally. You have to put yourself in a totally different place.
Yes.
One other thing.
That is true.
3 weeks ago, I checked out Larson's book, The Splendid and the Vile, all about Churchill, in graphic detail in the 40s and 1940 and 41. And there's kind of been a language prohibition out there. Don't ever compare any of our current dictators to Hitler.
Right.
And I'm sorry, but I am reliving the history that happened with Hitler and how he, bombed or was going to bomb England into submission. There are plenty of parallels now between this dictator who says he's going into Ukraine to deal with the neo-Nazis, which is projecting onto the other party what is really true of himself. So this whole thing about rational thinking is one thing, but history is definitely...
Yes. My response to that would be even megalomaniacs have limits. Like, say, take Saddam, who knew very little about the U.S. or about anything about the world outside of Iraq, which is why he miscalculated constantly and didn't understand. And even he did not use chemical weapons against our soldiers either in 1990 or 2003, where he easily could have. At least in 1990, he easily could have. We were prepared for it. And so there are certain limits to what even those sorts of individuals will do.
I learned today that the Ukraine has 4 nuclear reactors.
Oh, yes.
The Russians were getting very close to the first one, and it'd be very interesting to see if there's an accident, if they're going to take care of all 4 of those reactors, or the worst could happen.
That is a good question, a good point in that regard. I hadn't considered that. One of those things is those sorts of reactors they're very hard to, even if you want to do the monstrous thing and sabotage them, it's difficult to do. And so, because they're very sturdily built, and also if you don't know what you're doing, even if you want to cause mischief, you really can't. I think I remember like when ISIS in Libya took over some oil fields and in North Africa, and gas pipelines and stuff. And naturally, of course, they just want to blow it up. And any of you who've worked at natural gas, liquefied natural gas, or any sort of refinery or that situation knows it's very hard. You don't just light a match or break a pipe or something. So they couldn't figure out how to do that since they lacked that, petroleum engineering experience. So I think that would be the case as well. Plus, for the Russians themselves, just, it would be suicide as well for the troops to do that. So they may not want to do that in that regard. That is a bigger thing, is that the Russian troops are far less motivated than their opponents in that regard. They weren't expecting this. They were not propagandized into, this is why we're doing the invasion and so forth. So their morale will start to will presumably start to crack after a certain point, and they will not see the need for it.
I think that's true if you want to compare Putin and Hitler, because Hitler had the support of the majority of his population. When he took over Austria, they were thrilled to have Hitler there. So I don't think Putin has that kind of support, even within Russia, if any of the reports are true about the people who are protesting the war.
Yes, millions of, even those who don't protest are not willing to die for him. Millions of Germans were willing and did die for Hitler, even until the very end. So Putin, it's kind of a, it was always a low-cost bargain he put in there for you. You shut up, you don't make trouble, and you get your pension, you get your job, but you don't go die. And so it was never that sort of bargain in that regard. It was more like stay home, stay out of trouble, mind your own business, let him and his friends plunder the country. And so that is so that is a different sort of thing. Even the Soviet Union had problems in Afghanistan for that reason, where it's like, we're not willing to die for this anymore. And the Soviets were far more propagandized and militarized than Putin's current regime. So that is a good point in that regard. That yes, you had a question then, that gentleman. Yes.
Do you think Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the result of that will affect his desire to take over the Republic of Georgia?
I think he has what he wants in Georgia. I mean, he has...
Did you repeat what...
Okay, yes, your question is, given what's happening in Ukraine, will that affect his plans in Georgia? I think he has what he wants in Georgia. He has the region of South Ossetia, which is non-Georgian, and he has Abkhazia, which is a coastal region that is not Georgian, and those areas are ruled by his puppet rulers and stuff. He does, like, when he invaded Georgia before, he could have taken Tbilisi, their capital, but he did not. He did not even try it. So I think he doesn't really, at this point, care that much. What he would care about is, say, the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which all contain sizable Russian minorities, and they've complained in the past about those minorities allegedly being discriminated against. And so that's always been our worry, because those are NATO countries which we are obligated to defend, and they are very small countries, and we have very small forces there. So, our ability to defend them was always limited. I think whatever he's thinking there, this would cause him to be less likely to try to, kind of make up some pretext to go do that in that regard, because he's already consumed enough with trying to do what he can in Ukraine to bother about other places. Yes, sir?
I just related a phone call I received this morning from my grandson. When he finished the University of Texas, got office, he then went to Peace Corps and served in Ukraine.
Right.
And speaks language and so forth. He lived with two families while he was teaching English.
Right.
And he's maintained a real close relationship with the family. He was telling me this morning that in his communication with them, both families, the head of the family, has gone on to serve in the military.
Right. Oh, yes.
And
yes.
one of the sons, both of them are, they have big companies, and said that they're maintaining a really strong resolve. One of them lives over west of Kyiv.
Right.
The other one lives down close to close to the eastern part, the Rust Belt.
Right, right.
And he said this morning that there was a family. He saw a video because he watched this European TV and so forth. They captured a Russian soldier.
Right.
Small area called little small town, and the soldier was a young man. He was a young guy, and he was hungry. He said they had not eaten their outfit in 2 days.
Yes, there have been stories about.
They fed him.
Yes.
And let him call his mother in Russia and
Right.
know that she was okay. But he was relating to them, and they related that they're suffering. Some of the guys have driven holes in their gas tanks, drained and they call them.
Right.
Others have, cut the tires, damaged the tires, anything to slow the thing down, because they don't want to fight.
Right. There's very little motivation for what they're being asked to do. There were stories, I mean, even similar to this I've heard, where people would actually, the soldiers would go to houses for food, which you generally don't do when you're invading someone, or go ask people for gas to fill up the tank. So yes, so you have a kind of a sort of naivete and a complete lack of the sort of killer instinct that you would expect in soldiers in that situation. So it's also important that the Russian army, going way back, has always had problems with supply. They had it with the communists, they had it during the imperial period under the czars, so they've never been really good at that sort of thing, and this type of attack really taxes their abilities to feed, fuel, and maintain the soldiers in different ways. So yes, thank you for sharing that. That is a very valuable piece of insight. Yes.
He's an officer in the army.
Right.
In Germany, but he don't leave from Ukraine.
From Kuwait, yes.
And so he maintains pretty close relationship with his family.
Oh, yes.
In Ukraine.
Yes. Other questions? Yes, you're back there.
Yeah, I remember I was going to say that, but I just read that 5 top professors at Chinese universities have now denounced the invasion of Ukraine.
It wouldn't surprise me. They may have connections with Ukraine. They may know colleagues there or something. I haven't heard this either, but this wouldn't surprise me. Do you know did they do it on? They presumably had done it on Chinese social media.
It's a brand new article.
Right. So they probably, what that would indicate is they don't feel this will be a career damager for them. So that would be a further, if true, a further indication that the Chinese are hedging and, as I said, slowly backing away from Putin and trying and not wanting to be caught out on a limb and favor the losing horse in that regard. So yeah, that would not surprise me. I do think that the Chinese at some point may want to, try to edge Putin to back away or something, because a long protracted war in Ukraine is not in any way in China's interests. It does a bunch of things economically and politically which are detrimental to their plans in the world and so forth. Yes?
And then another thing I heard from Reed Zakari said it was important, make sure your 2 arch rivals are super strong, Russia and China, are
at each other's throats. Yes, I saw that. That was, yes. I saw that Sunday before last, yes. That is true. You always want to divide your enemies. Sometimes it's easier said than done in this regard. You want to have something you can give one of them that the other can't, or something like that. And it helps when they already don't like each other. Like the example he used was Nixon. Well, it's important to understand that by the time Nixon went to China, that was in 1972, the Chinese and the Soviets had severed diplomatic relations in like 1963. So they didn't even have diplomatic contacts at that time. They had a brief shooting war over an island near the Siberian border in March 1969, in which hundreds of Chinese and dozens of Russians died. They had fighting along the western borders in which thousands of Chinese died. So that was a fairly, that was, pushing on an open door there. So I agree that is correct, but in his example, that was a completely different situation. But I guess in this situation, Putin is kind of bringing that about in ways the Americans could not. It's easy, as I said, to get your enemies separated when they already dislike each other. And so you need one side to blunder in this sort of way to do that. But yes, you do want to keep them divided. And it's important to understand, as he put it, that we want to have closer relations with Russia than China does, and closer relations with China than Russia, and closer relations with China than Russia does with China. And we're able to achieve that for a long time, but it helped that for 25 years, from 1964 to 1989, the Chinese and the Soviets did not even have diplomatic relations. So they, so again, it's important to do, but it's very, everything foreign policy is situational. It depends on the cards you're dealt, on the situation you are, and you can't conjure things up out of thin air in that regard. Yes, sir.
Looking forward and
yes,
estimating and looking at crystal ball, if Ukraine comes out of this thing, it's still a country.
Yes.
Do you think they will be accepted into NATO?
Yeah, well, the thing is they have to get their military up to certain standards. So even if we had wanted to put them in NATO last year, they weren't prepared. So it's usually a many years process. So it's a many years. I think they may fast track the process or begin it in different ways to try to prepare that. I do think that's in the offing in that regard. Same with the EU. You have to be up to certain economic standards, which they're not even remotely up to yet. And that can be often a 10-year process and things like that. So those things may begin, but they're not like, you know, that you bestow on someone immediately. It's a long thing. You have to have certain standards and practices, and in terms of economics and things, you have to be up to a certain level before you can do that in that regard. Yes, sir.
I guess one thing that surprised me, you know, we've been used to anti-war protests over here over the years.
Yes, yes.
And it just seems like there's big anti-war protests on the Russian people.
Yes.
Not Russia, if the media reports are correct.
Yes, yes. They dislike the war. It's also important to understand that Russia, most of its army are conscripts. They're one-year conscripts, which those of you who've served in the military know how little prepared you get for war after 12 months. But they're one-year conscripts. Generally, most people, when they turn 18, this goes back to the Soviet period where it were two-year conscripts. You serve for 2 years. So they've always had, they have a small professional corps, which they hoped could win this war for them. But most of their army is not there by choice and not very willing to be there. And their parents aren't willing to have them there. You know, you have much fewer anti-war protests when you have a professional army of volunteers. As we all know, Vietnam versus more recent wars. And so that is another reason you're having the protests there and things like that, that people don't want their children to die and stuff. I remember during the first Chechnya war in 1994, when Boris Yeltsin was president, they literally had mothers journeying down to Chechnya and trying to pull their boys away. Like, you know, get Vlad out of here, get Ivan back home, and so forth. And that won't happen here, but you know, that shows the extent that, you know, people aren't willing to sacrifice in that sort of way. And that is very, and so that is a very important point to understand. And even if you don't have protests, people can be silently against it. Yes?
Do you know if we have any students in our colleges here locally from Russia or Ukraine?
I do not personally. I'm sure there are some, but I have no idea in that regard. On that.
And overall, will those students be allowed to stay?
Okay, so they do make exceptions on this. So for instance, Tiananmen Square in June 1989, there were many thousands of Chinese students here who supported the demonstrators and basically said, you know, we can't go back now. You know, we'll be in trouble if we go back. They'll know. And so what Congress did is they passed a law, you know, extending their visas and giving them chances to get asylum and stuff. So I'm sure similar things, similar accommodations would be made in this situation. Then, yes.
Well, I should let you know we are getting close to about 1
Yes, we are.
So we will need to close this down.
Okay, so 3 minutes. Yes, so this will be the final question then.
I was talking to my grandson this morning and asked him in his conversations with both past Peace Corps friends that's still in Ukraine, some there in Kyiv. What is he hearing about what are they communicating with their families, many of them have, in Russia?
Right.
And do they get in some accurate news? And he said that all of them he talked to said that their families, friends from Ukraine or in other places are filling them in on what's happening.
Right.
Because they get no news.
Oh yes, they get propaganda. So yes, they do have acts. The way Putin established it is he realized most Russians get their news from television, so he just got to control television. The internet, most people did not get their news from the internet, so he more or less allowed the dissidents to do stuff on the internet which no one else saw. So there are ways, it's not a hermetically sealed sort of thing the way the Soviet Union was. So he does not, you know, he propagandizes people, but if people want to find alternate information, they can seek it out, as your friend said. Yes, last question?
Can you explain Pakistan's role in supporting Russia?
Okay. Yes. So when the invasion happened, Pakistan's President Imran Khan was meeting with Putin. So Pakistan is both friendly with the U.S. and China and also friendly with Russia. So it wants to have no patron it's dependent on. In a way, kind of like Myanmar. So it wants to preserve good relations with everyone so it can get benefits. The other issue there is Russia could potentially have influence in Afghanistan, which Pakistan, very much being its southern neighbor, cares about. So they don't want Russia to cause problems for them in various ways, shapes, or forms. Granted, he met with Putin at the beginning of this invasion. If he was going this week, the visit may have gone differently. So Pakistan basically wants to remain kind of friendly with the great powers, but not beholden to any one of them. So it can use Russia as a way, when we get sick of Pakistan, to say like, oh, Vladimir, and then get the US to be nice to him, or the same with the Chinese.
So it's more of a PR.
Yes, it's a PR thing, and it's also playing one against the other. That, they're always able to say, if you don't give me what I want, I can go to this guy or this guy. So it's 1 o'clock. I hope you enjoyed this. We'll see if we can reschedule this next week, so I will see you then.